At 0900 local time on the 30th of June, somewhere in the gray water 120 nautical miles off the Philippine island of Luzon, the loudspeakers of the Chinese Southern Theater Command went live, not over a port, not over a base, over a reef, a bare scatter of rock that barely breaks the surface at high tide. Combat readiness patrols, the announcement said, naval and air, inside what Beijing now calls the territorial sea and airspace of Scarborough Shoal. A few miles away, an American and Filipino exercise was entering its fifth and final day. And the question hanging over all of it was, China's move that morning a strategic blunder or a calculated bet? Scarborough Shoal sits 120 nautical miles from Luzon, well inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone as defined under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. From China's Hainan Island, the nearest Chinese land, it is 594 nautical miles away. By the plain math of distance, this is Philippine water. In 2016, that argument was tested in court. The Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, ruling under Annex 7 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, found largely in favor of the Philippines. It declared Scarborough a rock, not an island, meaning it generates no exclusive economic zone, no continental shelf of its own. It declared China's sweeping 9-dash line, its land reclamation, and its activities in Philippine waters unlawful. But the control on the water was settled 4 years before the court ever spoke. In April 2012, a Philippine Navy surveillance aircraft spotted 8 Chinese fishing vessels at the shoal. Manila sent the BRP Gregorio del Pilar. An inspection on the 10th turned up illegally harvested coral, giant clams, and live sharks. The attempt to make arrests was blocked by Chinese vessels, and when the standoff ended, the atoll had passed into de facto Chinese control. It has stayed that way ever since. In the years from that ruling to today, China has tightened its grip, declaring a so-called National Nature Reserve over the area in the autumn of 2025, more than 3,500 hectares administered from Hainan. Manila called it a pretext for eventual occupation. Philippine officials read it as groundwork to justify an expanded claim. Beijing's foreign ministry called the shoal inherent Chinese territory. And yet, according to CSIS, China has still not built a single permanent physical structure on Scarborough. Unlike the Spratlys, where Beijing poured concrete and built runways on the reefs, here there is no outpost, no island factory, which means whatever China is doing at Scarborough, it has deliberately left itself a way to stop short. China's instrument of choice here is not, on paper, the Navy. It's the Coast Guard, and that distinction is the entire strategy. At the center of it are the vessels nicknamed the Monsters, Coast Guard cutters displacing around 12,000 tons, the largest of their kind anywhere in the world. One of them has sat anchored inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, which Manila reads as plain intimidation. The biggest cutter in the entire United States Coast Guard runs about 4,500 tons, Japan's largest patrol ships around 6,500. China's own regular Coast Guard vessels top out near 4,000. The Monster is roughly the displacement of a guided missile destroyer. Analysts reach for the Type 052D as a yardstick for the size. And that is the point. Naval specialists increasingly describe the Chinese Coast Guard as a quasi-naval force, warship-scale hulls painted in law enforcement white, so that every confrontation can be framed as policing rather than an act of war. The Southern Theater Command's naval and air forces sit behind them, in reserve, the harder edge held back. On the other side, the toolkit looks different because the legal footing is different. The centerpiece of the joint exercise was a drill called VBSS, Visit, Board, Search, and Seizure. The sequence is exactly what it sounds like. Approach a suspect vessel, put a team aboard, search it, and seize it if the law allows. And the two allies were practicing it together. Underwriting all of it is a single document. The Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951. Washington has repeatedly reaffirmed that Article 4 of that treaty covers an armed attack on Philippine forces, public vessels, or aircraft anywhere in the South China Sea. That phrase, anywhere, is doing enormous work. It means a white-hulled Coast Guard cutter bumped by a Chinese ship at a remote reef could, in theory, trigger a treaty with the United States. But notice the asymmetry underneath all this. China operates close to home. Even at nearly 600 nautical miles from Hainan, it sustains a permanent presence. The United States projects from far away and has done since it gave up Subic Bay and Clark after 1991, which is why some American strategists argue Washington's role here should be to support from the rear, not the front line. The trigger was the exercise itself, a 5-day U.S.-Philippine maritime drill near Scarborough, the third such exercise of the year, built around interoperability, maritime security, and that VBSS boarding sequence. To Manila and Washington, routine. To Beijing, provocation. The response came fast. On the 30th, the PLA Southern Theater Command announced combat readiness patrols, naval and air, in what it called the territorial sea and airspace of the shoal. The framing was deliberate, a countermeasure, Beijing said, against rights violations and provocative acts. Alongside the military, the Chinese Coast Guard announced its own law enforcement patrols, claiming it had dealt with vessels engaged in illegal activities at the shoal over the course of the month. And so the two narratives collided in the open. From Beijing, the Philippines are inviting outside forces into the region, forces that destabilize, and Scarborough is inherent Chinese territory. From Manila and Washington, the exercise sustains a defense relationship and a rules-based order. The Philippine Defense Secretary, speaking at the Shangri-La dialogue, said Manila faced a severe threat and that it was investigating preliminary reports of new structures at the shoal. What makes the timing genuinely strange is the backdrop. This escalation came despite a recent thaw between Trump and Xi, a warming at the top, and it unfolded against the diplomacy of the 2026 Shangri-La Dialogue, the region's premier security forum. By the script, this should have been a quiet season. It was not, and none of it is isolated. The showdowns at Scarborough have become frequent, close passes, blockings, an accidental collision between a PLA ship and a Chinese Coast Guard vessel as they moved to block a Philippine boat, the monster sitting in the EEZ, an American carrier holding station in the South China Sea until it was pulled away to the war with Iran, a steady drumbeat of which the 30th of June is the loudest beat so far. Every time Beijing leans on Manila, it pushes the Philippines closer to the United States, deeper defense ties, more frequent exercises, more American presence in exactly the waters China wants to itself. It burns the goodwill of a thaw Beijing only just achieved with Washington, and it takes a dispute China has always preferred to keep bilateral. By that reading, the 30th of June was an own goal. Now make the opposite case. This is salami slicing, and salami slicing works. It is cheap. It is, in the language of strategists, an operation other than war, gray zone pressure, mapped by RAND, and tracked in CSYS's counter-coercion work, designed to win ground without ever firing. And here's where that anchor pays off. By not building an outpost, China keeps plausible deniability intact. It can apply pressure, claim it is merely policing its own territory, and leave itself room to step back. The 30th of June becomes a test of American resolve under the cover of a new thaw, a bet that Washington will not risk a war over Iraq. And that is the trap underneath all of it. CSIS has laid out the scenario plainly. If China keeps testing the American commitment, Washington eventually faces a choice between military escalation against a nuclear power or the perceived abandonment of an ally. And equivocation between those two would be catastrophic for the American position. Layer on the everyday danger, crowded sea and sky, civilian and military traffic mixing, where a single accident could trip the very treaty everyone is maneuvering around. So which was it? A blunder that drove the Philippines into American arms and squandered a fragile peace, or a patient, deniable squeeze that cost Beijing almost nothing and quietly tightens its hold on a reef the court already said was not its own? The honest answer is that we don't yet know, because the move was designed not to force one. The structures are unconfirmed, the outpost still isn't built, the bet is still on the table. What we do know is that the next confrontation is already being scheduled. There will be a fourth exercise, and a fifth, and somewhere in that sequence, the careful ambiguity of Scarborough Shoal runs out. What China does the day it decides to finally build is the question that decides the whole South China Sea.